Folks, let me tell you about this worst case scenario for the seller. Then I'll get into the latest home prices and insights for the City of Toronto for week ending April 30th, 2023. We recently purchased a property. Now, this property was tenanted. That's important to know. And the seller was losing a lot of money on this sale. And it's just from simple math. I know what the seller bought the home for. I know what we purchased it for. I know the basic closing costs, what it costs to buy a home. The seller only bought the home, closed on the home just three and a half years ago. And so just simple math, I know the seller was losing about $350,000. So losing a ton of money, and the home is tenanted. My clients liked it. We put in an offer. Before I put in the offer, I did speak with the listing agent, and because there's tenants, I asked them about closing dates and so forth, and vacant possession. And the listing agent's attitude was, "Oh, we've already spoken with the tenants. Put in the closing date that you want. Everybody's flexible." Okay, so that's what we did. My clients, the buyers, wanted a fairly short closing period. They wanted 4 weeks. So today we put in the offer. Closing date was 4 weeks from that date. Well, once we submitted the offer, they came back to us, the seller side, with a slightly different change in their, their attitude towards closing. A short closing date was no longer on the table, and it wasn't going to work out for them. And they said that they need to go according to the landlord and tenant rules, which was 2 months notice from the first of the month. And that's the date that was reflected when they sent us the counter offer. I explained this to my clients, the buyers. They weren't excited about it, but what can we do? So my clients accepted the offer. The price that they came back at was, although we negotiated that quite a bit a few times, it wasn't that far off from our initial offer. So again, I know the seller, in accepting our offer, was losing about $350,000. We're approaching closing date. We're 4 weeks before closing date. And I get a call from the seller side. The listing agent calls me and says, "Santo, we're going to have an issue with the closing date. We need to extend it another 2, maybe 3 weeks." And I said, "Well, we've agreed on that. It's now approaching closing date. We're only 4 weeks away from closing. I don't know if my clients can move the closing date." Because I also know my clients had made plans. They've taken time off work. They've organized moving. They've made all sorts of plans for that closing date, as most buyers do, especially when they're excited about the home. This is a home that they're moving into themselves. And so I know they had all these plans, but I did speak to my clients, the buyers, about the change in closing date, that this is what the seller side is suggesting. And my clients just repeated what I already believed to be true, that they've taken time off work, they've got plans, they've got everything lined up for that closing date. So my clients were not prepared to move the closing date at all. And I told this to the seller side, and they kept insisting. A week and a half went by with them insisting. The problem was that the tenant did not want to move out on that date. The tenant was looking for 2 weeks or 3 weeks more. That's what all this stemmed around. And I told the seller side that, "Hey, my clients are just not going to move the closing date. You should figure this out with your tenants." And they said, "We're trying, but we're trying both sides. We're trying to get the tenant to move. We're trying to get you to move." And I said, my clients are just not moving. This is way, way too costly for them to try to make these arrangements to move. We're going to be ready to close on closing date. And if the seller's not able to give vacant possession, there's going to be a problem. The seller's going to be in breach, which they already knew that. To make a long story short, we did end up closing on the closing date that was specified in the agreement. And what ended up happening was that the seller ended up negotiating with the tenant, financially negotiating with the tenant, that the tenant leaves on the closing date specified in the agreement of purchase and sale between us and the seller. The tenant, in a sense, although knew what the rules were, really had all the power here. The tenant was the one that was in the household, not willing to leave unless whatever they negotiated with the seller was obviously in the tenant's favor to do so. And so not only in this sale was the seller losing about $350,000 just with the math of what they bought it for and what we are now buying this home for. On top of that, they had to pay, I can't tell you exactly how much, but they had to pay quite a bit of money to the tenants to get them out in time. This scenario happens often out there. We're getting ready to list a property that was tenanted, and the seller had negotiated with the tenant that the tenant actually vacates before we put the property on the market. They're not getting kicked out. It was a discussion, and they negotiated terms, and a tenant is happily leaving under whatever terms my client, which in this case is going to be the seller for this other property I'm speaking about, they negotiated that ahead of time, so the tenant is going to be out just to avoid the scenario that I just explained, where the home gets sold and the tenant is in the home and decides they're not going to leave when they're supposed to leave. There's rules in place, but the way things work out according to the rules don't really often help the landlord in facilitating the fact that they're able to give vacant possessions. And so I urge anybody, I'm telling this story because it does happen quite often. If you have a situation where you're selling a property that's tenanted, you really need to, in advance, work out a solution with the tenant that everybody knows what's going on and that the tenant is prepared to leave. It's sometimes difficult to do this, and there's certain things that come up in these discussions, and the tenant is the one that's in the home. They have possession of the home, but you really got to work this stuff out ahead of time, because once you have an agreement of purchase and sale in place, you're also involving a buyer that is making their plans, and the tenant is really holding all the cards right now. So be careful about these scenarios. If you're selling a property that's tenanted, work everything out with the tenant ahead of time so there's no misunderstanding and you're not in a position as a seller to really be at the whim of what the tenant wants to do. If you think this scenario can help somebody you know, please pass it along. If you get value from what we're talking about, subscribe. And if you want to speak with me about your real estate situation, selling, buying, it's really simple. There's a link below this video in the description. It's a link to my calendar. Click on that or go directly to tsre.ca. That'll take you to my calendar. Book a date and time that suits you, and we'll talk about whatever's on your mind. Now, let's get into the numbers. Folks, are you watching the games? Go Leafs, go. Very exciting. Here we go. We're focused on the city of Toronto only. This show is going to be about the freehold market. These are average sold prices. I do have average sold prices for condo apartments down here just for reference. The difference between the average condo price and the average detached price is $932,000. So huge, huge price gap there. Here we go. Detached only right now we're looking at for week ending April 30th. There's 158 detached properties sold. 40 of those were at $2 million or more. Now, if we're looking at sales, we're up from the previous week. The previous week was Easter. Sales tend to dip during any weekend holidays, any long weekend. Sales usually take a dip for that week, and we're back up a little bit. Overall, I would say sales have been trending up, not every single week in a row, but overall, more and more sales. Average sold price for week ending April 30th is up from the previous week. It's now $1,652,000. It's up, but overall, over the past month, month and a half, kind of looks like average price has been trending downward. The whole average sold price for the whole city of Toronto for detached properties is $1,652,000. But if we break that down, the 3 bedrooms, average sold price was $1,457,000. 4-bedroom homes, the average sold price was $2,116,000. Difference between 3-bedroom homes and 4-bedroom homes, average price difference of $659,000. Compared to last year, 1,652 is 7% lower year over year. The median price is 1% lower. The dotted line, that's a 4-week moving average. When we look at the median 4-week moving average, not a lot of price differences. The average price, also not a lot of price differences, but I would say overall, if we go back, kind of looks like prices are trending down slightly. 158 were sold. 45% of those sold at list price or more. Lots of listings of detached properties. 476 were listed. Active listings, the amount of detached properties available for sale, climbing. We're now at 2,390. And months of inventory sitting at 3.5 months of inventory. This is for week ending April 30th. But if we kind of look back to the beginning of March, 3.5 kind of seems normal, average so far. We haven't seen too much of a fluctuation in months of inventory over the previous few weeks. That's for the whole city. If we break Toronto down into 9 different sections, and let's look at sales, for example. Scarborough had 34 sales. Scarborough accounted for 22% of all sales in the city of Toronto of detached properties. So if we look at Scarborough and we look at Etobicoke, 37 sales, that's 23% of all sales. So between Etobicoke and Scarborough, you're looking at 45% of all sales in the city of Toronto, just Scarborough and Etobicoke. The rest is the other 55%. So most of the sales are between Etobicoke and Scarborough. But if we're looking at months of inventory, High Park had 14 sales. Months of inventory in High Park is 1.9. Extremely competitive out there. Here's semi-detached properties. April 30th, 64 semi-detached properties were sold. 64 is a huge jump from the previous week, but it's also pretty high compared to every week so far this year. 64 were sold. 13 of those sold at $1.5 million or more. Average sold price did climb from the previous week. It's now $1,275,000. But overall, it looks like average price for semi-detached has been trending downward. Compared to last year, 1275 is 6% lower. The median price of 1,183,000 is 7% lower. Months of inventory sitting at 1.8 months of inventory. 59% of all semis that sold at list price or more. Here's freehold townhouses. 11 were sold for week ending April 30th. 3 of those were at $1.5 million or more. Average sold price is $1,268,000. 1,268 is 4% higher year over year. The median price of $1,240,000 is 5% lower. And months of inventory sitting at 5.2 months of inventory. That's for townhouses. Here's a quick summary of months of inventory. It's all over the place. You've got your detached at 3.5, semis at 1.8, freehold towns at 5.2. Just for reference, condos is at 7.5. Everything you need to know about condos, that show is tomorrow. But if we just focus on detached, semis, and towns, you're going to experience seller's market, balanced market, buyer's market. You're going to experience it all. Your neighborhood, price point, house type will all have something to do with the kind of market that you're going to experience. Thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.